My name's Craig Thomas. I'm a professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Washington. I came here knowing pretty much nothing about amenity communities except being a tourist. I'm a mountaineer and wilderness person, so my wife and family were always going out and going through these towns, so it's really interesting to learn about all the issues that are going on. I've seen some of them. I've been to Moab quite a bit. One thing that I haven't heard, what's interesting, is in my community, there's a lot of Facebook and meetup groups that we track, my wife and I. One of the things that these groups often note is where the coffee shops are, where the good places are to get IPA, local brews, and not Starbucks, by the way. I'm from Seattle. A true Seattleite does not drink Starbucks. It's bad coffee. If you want to... Lots of us come out to these communities, these small communities that are considering how they might want to manage for growth, looking for the funkiness, looking for the bakeries like the one, or the coffee shops that was mentioned in one of the talks that was right out of a house. And a lot of the knowledge about that is coming through particular kinds of social media, not the Instagrams, but these groups that are looking for wilderness experiences away from places like Park City. And I'm often driving and I'm saying to my wife, find the good coffee shop on the way, because we want to come out of, go into the mountains, find the good coffee, and then come out and find the good IPA and bison burger. So there's another way maybe to think about how to market yourselves that's different from state advertising. By the way, so my school is a graduate school of public policy, so I'm training people to take jobs like Flint's and Nan's positions. So that's the way I think. And my peeps, my students, go to places like the Forest Service in Seattle and the EPA. So let me now talk about our panelists. We'll go in order from left to right. First, we have Steve ODell. Very interesting talking with Tanner last night. He's been representing Forest Service, BLM, a number of federal agencies with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's now in Oregon and goes all the way back. You started with the case Spotted Owl versus Lujan, which is one of the original Spotted Owl cases before the Dwyer decision. That was a case forcing the agencies to consider a critical habitat for the spotted owl, settled in 1991. Sorry to date you. So we're going to hear from the person who has to represent these agencies that are constantly being sued. Then we'll come to Elizabeth Kitchens, who's also trained as an attorney, but works for the Nature Conservancy, which is a very collaborative agency, or collaborative nonprofit, excuse me, which is not known at all for litigation. And in my own work studying collaborative natural resources management, the Nature Conservancy is quite famous for managing natural resources in a non-adversarial, science-informed way. And then we'll come to Breanna Sweat, who's a PhD student at Stanford in an interdisciplinary program. I consider interdisciplinary work super important. We have too many people trained in the disciplines, and she's bringing social sciences and natural sciences together to understand transformations. And she'll drill down more into a specific issue in a specific place, ranching in specifically. So I'm going to ask each of them to come up and introduce themselves and give their presentations. Steve.
All right, so it's a great pleasure to be here. I am a longtime litigator. I'm here, I think, primarily because I have two great passions for and affinities for the institutions and the issues that are represented here. I'm a native Westerner, grew up in Oregon and live there now, as Craig was saying, but I also spent a long time at Stanford. I have 2 degrees from Stanford. Both my undergraduate degree and my law degree are from Stanford. And I actually worked there for a couple of years for the Stanford basketball program. And so when I got the invitation to attend an alumni event in Portland a couple of years ago at the tail end of a class that had been studying the Columbia hydropower system, I jumped at the chance and went, and for the first time heard about the Rural West Institute and the Bill Lane Center, and I was immediately intrigued because I've been working on these issues in one way or another for about 3 decades now. And again, I am from the West originally and have a great love for the West. So I followed up with John and stayed in touch. And when he mentioned that there was going to be a conference on this particular topic, I thought I would like to at least attend, if not maybe be able to contribute if I had anything, because like Craig, I'm not really all that much of an expert, if any, on amenity migration per se. But on this particular topic, most all of my work in a variety of different contexts has focused on environmental effects of the way humans interrelate to and use natural resources. And so let me just quickly give you my background in that, if I can, to give you a little bit more of a flavor and a context for where I'm going as I proceed through my presentation. So probably the most interesting or unique thing about my experience is I've worked in all 3 branches of the federal government. I started out as a judicial law clerk in the District of Oregon and also in the Ninth Circuit, which for those of you who are not familiar, encompasses the 9 most western states. And so had a lot of opportunity in that context to work on how to resolve these issues when they come to litigation in helping a judge fashion opinions on environment and natural resource issues. Then I've also spent a long time in the Justice Department litigating these cases on the other side of the bench, approaching judges and trying to convince them of the rightness of my position, of course. And there's a tremendous amount of environment and natural resources litigation in Oregon. I also represent the Bonneville Power Administration, which operates and sells the market and markets the energy from the federal hydropower system. And then thirdly, I have also worked on the Hill for the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, where obviously there's a much broader view of these particular kinds of issues. So that's what I bring to the table. So let me just start first here with the roadmap. And I want to explain David Byrne up there first. Okay? So this will date me too, probably. The first reason is the classic line in this song is, where does that highway lead to, right? So this is, I'm going to tell you where my highway is leading to. And secondly, it is one of the 2 greatest rock concert movies of all time. And bonus points if any of you can get the other one. Rattle and hum? You too? Anyway, okay. So with that out of the way. So I'm going to start by popping off, if you will, from Oregon. Okay, a few broadly framed fundamental axioms and propositions that drive the environmental effects of amenity migration. And these are from my perch as someone who has not studied these issues as a scholar or has been directly involved in planning, but just what I've observed through the working on these issues in a variety of different contexts. And then the other thing that's critical, and this was touched on a lot yesterday, but it's obviously has been a critical role in the work I've done, is the implications of the huge amounts of federal land ownership in most of these rural western communities and how that affects the environmental implications of the decisions that are made. And then I want to close with 3 specific case examples if I have time, which reminds me I want to be timing myself here, so I leave plenty of time for Breanna and Elizabeth. So, fundamental axioms and propositions. So my view of it is these environmental effects stem largely from the resolution of 3 overarching issues. How and where we live, obviously, because we're talking about migration, right? That's pretty obvious. But how and where we work, because in a capitalist system like we have, people have to have jobs to support themselves, more or less. And then third, how and where we play. And interestingly enough, and this was touched on again yesterday as well, on the where, so, and I want to make clear there are 2 different pieces to each of those questions. It's not just where, but how. Because just because someone decides to live somewhere or at a particular location, it also depends upon how they choose to live there. If it's a second home, if it's their primary residence, if they're just a tourist or so forth, or just visiting, right? But as technology progresses, particularly in the transportation communication fields, the locations of each of those 3 different things can be increasingly disaggregated or disparate, right? Whereas we find, I contrast this with what I've observed in urban areas where we're actually trying to do the reverse in many respects. We want people to live in cities to be able to work and live and play and do most everything they can in a very small footprint and without a lot of transportation, because we want to reduce the carbon footprint and we don't want urban sprawl, we don't want to take up more land and so forth. So it's interesting how in rural communities in some respects, especially as we're getting larger aggregations of wealth, which was talked about yesterday as well, and these people have money to spend on moving different places and having playgrounds at their disposal, it's moving in that direction more in the rural areas. So on the how, I think there are four main factors that influence the how of we decide to live, work, and play that affect in the environment. The almost unrestrained legal freedom of movement Americans have, right? That's number one. This is not a society that's hugely planned. It's not communist. We can't tell people you got to live in this particular area. You can't move over there. So, and I say with some important caveats because obviously in history there have been limitations on that. I will pick on Oregon. In the Oregon Constitution, as originally adopted, there was a clause that said African Americans could not live in the state of Oregon. Obviously, it was horrendous and is no longer the case, but through history we have had those limitations on occasion. But generally under the Privileges and Immunities Clause and the way the Supreme Court has interpreted that, citizens in the US can go wherever they want for the most part, and they can choose to live wherever they want. Now there are practical limitations, right? You might have limitations on your ability to get a job somewhere. You might have limitations on your ability to afford where you want to live. But as even we learned in expensive places like Moab, I mean, you can move there and be a homeless person, right? I mean, so you can pretty much go where you want. We have freedom of movement in the United States. Then there's technology, which of course is kind of a double-edged sword, right? I mean, technology over time has given us greater freedom and allowed us to pursue many more endeavors so that you can travel pretty much on a dime wherever you want in the world to recreate, far away from your primary residence. And it also has increased our ability to impact our natural resources to a much greater extent than was ever the case before. When you were working with hand tools, obviously, even if you wanted to have a huge impact and convert an area, a natural area, into an area that you could, develop, you had limitations and just your ability to get the work done. Now, with extraordinary amounts of technology we have available, we can have tremendous effects on our natural environment. But it also cuts in the other direction, right? Because it can give us more efficient ways of achieving our outcomes if we're wise. But culture is also really important, and this is, I really was thankful for how Justin talked about this the other day, because we can have all the know-how in the world and we can even have these elegant systems and designs and plans, but if the people who aren't living in those communities aren't buying in or their value system is different, you're not going to be able to implement it. I learned this in a little bit different context when I worked on the Hill. I would work relentlessly to come up with what I thought was like this extraordinarily sophisticated plan for how to reform the wetlands legislation in Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And I would present it to folks as, okay, here it is, let's just implement it. And people would say, well, we had no role in its development. You didn't really allow us to be a participant in coming up with this. So you know what? It's DOA, it's dead on arrival. And then this leads to how values are mediated both individually and collectively into the decisions that either constrain or facilitate or encourage certain outcomes, right? So people can pretty much go where they want, do what they want, recreate where they want, but we can certainly do things in our institutions, in our decision-making processes that make it either easier or harder. The critical role of challenges posed by change. I just am going to quickly roll through this because I get into my specific examples, but it's one of the hardest things for people to do, but I thought the discussion yesterday really highlighted this. It's inevitable, and so is Heraclitus. I'm not a Greek philosopher, is that right? Okay, yeah, said, the only constant in life is change, or a rough paraphrase thereof. And so, like when we talked about or heard about the situation, I believe it was in Midway, where you had folks who said, hey, change is coming. Stasis is not really an option. So we can either accept that and figure out how to get ahead of that curve a little bit and try to navigate it, or we can kick at the goads, dig our heels in, and let the change overwhelm us potentially and get angry and bitter and fight in cases like we heard about at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which I also had some involvement with, unfortunately. And then that leads to my fourth bullet, which is how these decisions are made is just as important as what the ultimate outcome is. Going back to my example, I mean, you can have a very elegant design and plan and say this is based on all the best science available, but at the end of the day, people need to feel a sense of ownership in the ultimate outcome. Following up just on that refuge situation really quickly, one of the other experiences I had is after that occurred, my U.S. attorney called me in, and he said, you know, what were the seeds of this? They're obviously frustrated with the federal government and how the federal government is managing lands in their communities. And I said, well, I think part of it is they feel like they're not being heard, okay? And so we designed a plan where we went to all 17 counties out of the 36 in Oregon that have a third or more federal lands within their boundaries. And we went to them. We went to John Day. We went to Baker City. We went all to these small towns and communities in the east. They said, we've never had a U.S. attorney come visit, and we listened. And so we didn't come up with any grand outcomes, but I will tell you there have been situations since the Malheur occupation where we've had county judges and county council members call the U.S. attorney and say, hey, I think there's a tense situation that is evolving here as a result of a federal management situation that you need to be aware of, and we've been able to diffuse it behind the scenes just because we have a relationship. So those relationships are important in how the decisions are made. So the overarching observation I would make is we have a Goldilocks dilemma, right? We want to achieve this great balance to get to what is just right. But how do you define that? And it's going to be different for pretty much everyone, or most everyone. There are going to be lots of different perspectives on what that is. So we heard it yesterday. Some people said, well, now my community is just the way I want it, so let's put the drawbridge up. I don't want it to change anymore, right? Where some people are saying, no, we need more economic development. Or, hey, I've been in this community for 5 generations, like we heard also yesterday, and so I want to maintain that character. This is who I am, and why can these newcomers come in here and try to tell us what to do? And I put 2 different pictures up there because it has 2 components to it, right? One is based on, and this is the Goldilocks zone in astronomy, we're talking about the habitable zone in the universe, right? So there is kind of a natural physical science part of it where that can help us decide where that just right zone is for the balance of all these factors on environmental effects, but at the same time providing for enough economic development to allow the community to thrive and have the kinds of amenities that people were drawn to the place originally for. But at the same time, there's a very subjective element to it. And that's why I have the other one of Goldilocks in the old story, which is, you know, what might be just right for me in terms of what I want in my porridge may not be just right for you. All right, I've got to roll through. I've got like 2 minutes. So obviously we see huge amount of federally owned land. This was covered pretty much yesterday, so I'll just skip by that. So I just point out quickly, there's challenges and opportunities from this. First is it can be really difficult to get anything done because there's a lot of bureaucracy and there are now a lot of laws that there weren't before really the 70s when the environmental movement really took off. And we have the National Environmental Policy Act, which basically means anytime the federal government wants to do anything that will have an impact on the environment, they have to go through an analytical exercise to examine those effects, and the public has to have a chance to be involved in that, which is a good thing, but it can be time intensive, and it also can really stop things up. Federal means federal. This is also really important because these lands are federal lands, and so I heard this a lot from the people in local communities that we met with, and they would say, how come some guy in Manhattan gets the same amount of say about what happens on these federal lands that are in my backyard as I do, because I live here, and what happens with the management of the federal land is going to affect me directly. That doesn't seem fair to me. As a legal matter, federal does mean federal, and the reality is that any U.S. citizen then has theoretically the same exact right and interest in land, whether they've been there or not, whether it's 1,000 miles away or not. At the same time, I think we have to recognize in terms of the practical implications, the people who live in those communities adjacent to those lands are going to be much more affected. And I'd like to see a way to, and there are more creative ways that we're examining to get them a little more involved and make them feel like, I don't want to say a thumb on the scale, but that we take those more practical implications seriously for them. obviously not as many economic development options given the dearth of private land. And then they can often serve as a magnet, as we heard yesterday, for this amenity migration or lots of tourism, which can be a downside, right? If you're loving the land to death, you're loving these amenities to death, right? So that's a challenge. Then on the other hand, the opportunities, again, same thing. They serve as a magnet for people to come in. They can serve as economic drivers and development opportunities. The other thing, though, I was going to point out about the opportunities I see from a lot of federal land ownership in a particular area is it can provide a little bit more of a democratic vehicle for determining how these lands should be managed. In other words, we've heard about billionaires coming in and buying up land. Okay, billionaires can't buy national forest land, right? So it's set aside for the public. That's the upside of having it be public land. And then it provides everybody with that opportunity to be involved and have their voice heard about how it should be managed. That also presents the challenge. That's the flip side to why it's so hard to get anything done on those lands, because everybody has a say in how it's managed. So it's not very efficient, but it does provide a more democratic vehicle. And then, of course, the diverse array of extremely valuable natural resources they provide and conserve, right? From drinking water, I don't think, a lot of people don't know. National forests, the main reason the national forests were originally set aside was for drinking water, okay? It was partly to stop the liquidation of the forest, which was also occurring at a massive pace as development came west. But it also had a huge amount to do with protecting watersheds for municipalities that were growing. So I'm down to 1 minute. I'm just going to do my first litigation example because I want to turn it over to Elizabeth. But Bend is the kind of the ultimate amenity migration city in Oregon. It was the fastest growing community in America for many, many years, or in the top 10 at least. And I mean, I think most of you know it's on the east side of the Cascades, so it gets like 300 days of sunshine, has incredible skiing, mountain biking, great ales, I think it has more microbreweries per capita than any other city in the country as well, something like that. Well, Bend, it went from, I want to say 40,000 to up to 80,000 almost overnight. And a lot of folks coming in from California. We've seen these people are commuting actually from Silicon Valley. Like I heard some people are commuting to and from Utah now to live in Bend, or at least have a second home there so they can have it as their playground on the weekends. Well, Bend needed to replace their aging and decrepit water pipelines. Well, because Bend is surrounded mostly by national forest land, turns out they had to get a Forest Service permit in order to replace their aging pipelines. Now, most communities wouldn't have that problem, right, if you're not surrounded by national forest system lands. And so what happened is, going to the point about the potential downsides of amenity migration, depending upon whose ox is being gored and what your perspective is, we had some folks in Bend who said, we've grown enough, and this water pipeline is now a proxy for further growth. So the litigation really focused on the capacity of that replacement pipeline. The city said, look, we've been growing a lot. We're going to be practical about this. We're probably going to continue to grow, maybe not at the same rate. But if we're going to replace this pipeline, it's a once in a 7-year project, we should probably put in a bigger pipeline. Well, the environmental community didn't want the bigger pipeline because they knew if you put in a bigger pipeline, you can, over time, use it to divert more water, and that's therefore going to allow more people to move in. If you have a limited amount of water to supply to the citizens, it'll put a cap effectively on the people that can move there over time. Ultimately, we were successful in that case in both the District Court and the Ninth Circuit, and I will suspend my other two to pass this over to Elizabeth. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I have to be honest with you and say the term amenity migration was not really a part of my daily vocabulary until the past few months. I guess I just didn't know that there was a fancy term for the fact that there seem to be a lot more people now in places where we traditionally have had more animals than people, whether those animals are cattle or sheep or elk, pronghorn, etc. Let me start out by saying thank you for inviting me here to be a part of this panel. I have learned so much over the last day and a half. I was at Stegner Symposium 2 weeks ago, and with this following it, wow, my head is really turning about all the things that need to be done and how the Nature Conservancy can be involved. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about the Nature Conservancy, just to tell you who we are and a little bit of our background in conservation work in the rural West. But let me back up and say that I am rural West, born and bred. I was born in Roswell, New Mexico, lived there until I was 18 years old. My grandfather on my father's side was a cattle rancher, and my grandfather on my mother's side was an alfalfa farmer. So while we didn't really have to deal with amenity migration that much in Roswell, although there is that UFO thing that everybody mentions every now and then, it was dealing with the issues of how do we keep the economy going. And so I know that my grandparents dealt with those issues. So the Nature Conservancy. The mission of the Nature Conservancy is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We value nature for nature's sake, for the intangible benefits that it provides to people, and for all of the invaluable ecosystem services it provides, which makes our planet livable. Our organization has operations in all 50 states and in over 50 countries around the globe. TNC has, for the majority of its 65 plus years, been a land trust. And in Utah, which has been around for 35 years, I had to correct this old slide, we have operated as a land trust. We own over, sorry, I've lost my place on my notes here. We've been around for 35 years. We own 17,000 acres in fee. We hold over 40 conservation easements that encompass 6,800 acres, primarily in rural Utah. We have either directly or indirectly protected over 1.2 million acres in Utah. We pride ourselves on being a science-based organization, meaning that we identify threats to nature through science and bring best available science to developing resolutions to those threats. We are also non-confrontational. So as Steve mentioned, we do not litigate. We collaborate, and sometimes to the point of frustration of our members, fellow NGOs, and even within our own organization. However, we have found that this really does, this basic operating principle of being non-confrontational opens doors for us. We are also community-based. This is where we forge our root-level relationships, which then, because local voices matter, and we then use those relationships to develop collaborations on a greater scale. So over the last, I'd say, dozen years, the Nature Conservancy, the global organization, has undergone a major evolution as we've stretched beyond our comfort zone of being a land trust and really scaled up our resources. Due in large part to the increasing impacts of climate change on our planet, our leadership and our global board of directors felt compelled to focus our resources and more clearly define our priorities across the organization to tackle the most urgent threats to nature. So, the Nature Conservancy is no longer just a land trust. We are engaged in a number of cross-cutting strategies to address climate change and complex issues around providing sustainable water and food for nature and for people. Yes, we are still a land trust, thankfully. That is our lifeblood. However, to meet those urgent needs and threats to nature, we have scaled up our efforts to protect nature, transform how we interact and think about nature, and inspire people to take action for nature. So now to the topic of this panel. Over the course of this conference, we've heard about the political implications, the cultural implications, economic implications of amenity migration, and two potential environmental consequences of this phenomenon to humans could be reduced air quality, reduced water quality. I am going to talk about another environmental consequence of amenity migration, and that is to non-humans. I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat fragmentation. Carl talked about this yesterday in his comments. We have people, as I said, in places where traditionally there have been lots of land and open space for herds of elk and pronghorn and other wide-ranging species. We have had ample room and water for avian species such as the greater sage grouse or for the migratory birds that depend on the Great Salt Lake. This slide shows some examples here in Utah where we have rampant habitat fragmentation. The growth in St. George has greatly affected the desert tortoise habitat there. Davis County is encroaching on the wetland complexes of the Great Salt Lake and affecting migratory and shorebird habitat there. And then I think that we've talked a little bit about down around Moab and the amenities that are there, and the BLM that has campsites, but sometimes there is camping not in the designated sites, and how that affects wildlife movement. So these wildlife have moved for centuries across particular corridors. And we talked a little bit about planning yesterday, and these corridors are not always considered when humans start engineering and planning their infrastructure. And oftentimes the changes, the new infrastructure, roads, highways, I mean, this is nothing new, right? I mean, we've been building highways across elk paths for years, and that's why we have so much roadkill along the way. It happens so quickly that they are not able to adapt. Or in the worst case scenarios, there is no alternatives. For example, in the west, the terminal lakes, such as the Great Salt Lake, are under tremendous threat as their water sources are being converted to drinking water sources. And again, the migratory birds are finding that they have very few alternatives. And another example that I think, I don't think this amenity migration or habitat fragmentation comes to mind when recently there was a story in the news about a young man that was trail running and was attacked by a mountain lion, and was actually had to kill the mountain lion, which is kind of amazing. But again, he was, and I think he even observed, he was in that lion's habitat. And I don't know how many of you hiking here in the Wasatch have had a close encounter with a moose, a truly terrifying experience. But again, is the trespass really ours or theirs? So what I'd like to move to next is how the Nature Conservancy is trying to address habitat fragmentation through science, and how that rolls up to what we hope is better policy. So, the goal of the Conservancy's protection work, our work as a land trust in acquiring properties or conservation easements, is to create a network of resilient sites and connected corridors that will sustain the natural diversity by allowing species to adapt to climate impacts and thrive. To achieve this goal, the Nature Conservancy is conducting a landscape-level analysis to identify areas which models indicate possess the greatest potential for adaptation and resiliency, taking into account to the greatest extent possible human development and climate change. In turn, this science is going to help our local chapter staff identify where we should focus our land acquisition efforts, and advocate for legal protections through statute or by commenting and advising land managers on land management plans. We've invited other stakeholders, such as state wildlife agencies, to help inform this effort, and we're sharing our results with them and with other like-minded organizations, again, to hopefully roll this up into more effective land management policies to protect habitat. So another similar tool is what we call landscape conservation forecasting. I was talking to someone yesterday about this. This is a spatial analysis tool that we have used to assist corporations that have large land holdings and federal agencies such as the BLM with land management planning on a large scale. LCF is what we call it, and it is a computer-based predictive model that forecasts the likely future condition of vegetation on large landscapes under alternative management scenarios. So while this tool doesn't directly account for human development, it does reflect the current and predicted level of unintended consequences of such development, including invasive plant species, effect on native plants, and other factors such as wildfire. Another area where we're involved, and particularly in Utah, very much of our time is spent on water resources. So as populations increase in rural towns, water resources become more scarce. And as a report that I've got the cover here on the slide was prepared by the Western Governors Association and the Western Water Council, municipalities and developers will often come in and buy up land from struggling ranchers and farmers, and they'll permanently change the water rights from irrigation or stock water to municipal uses or culinary uses. The ag land is then left literally high and dry, and this is referred to in the literature as by and dry. The ag land is virtually useless without the water rights. The stock water ponds that likely also helped water wildlife are gone. The return flows from irrigation that recharged aquifers and streams is gone. And so you've lost a water resource for not only ag production, but for nature as well. So the Nature Conservancy here in Utah is working with a large group of stakeholders to put a little bit more flexibility into our water laws. For example, a farmer could take a portion of his water rights and place it into a water bank. I'll go to the next slide. Retain a portion of his water right. That water right that's put into the water bank could then be leased on a temporary basis by a municipality or by the Nature Conservancy for in-stream flows. And that allows the farmer or rancher to continue their livelihood and perhaps even transition to a more water-wise crop. The bottom line goal is to create more incentives for water conservation than under the current system, which really is a use it or lose it system. Finally, I want to note that the Nature Conservancy is very active. Our policy work includes traditional advocacy. So just because we're non-confrontational doesn't mean that we do not strongly advocate in political environments. We participate on advisory committees, such as those that are formed for national monuments. We participate on resource advisory councils that are put together by the BLM and Forest Service. We also have a very strong voice in Washington where we advocate for federal legislation, such as the recent lands bill that was passed that protects a large part of Emory County, and the permanent reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So we're a very strong proponent for conservation funding, both at the state and federal level. And then we also defend against attacks against NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera, which can mitigate habitat fragmentation. So in closing, I just want to say that the Nature Conservancy does always try to find this balance. That word's been mentioned a number of times over the last day and a half, and that is truly what we seek to do. We realize that amenity migration is really only one factor. It's the cumulative effect of a number of factors that really have the potential to create severe damage to nature, which is the reason why we have amenity migration. I often walk through the Salt Lake City airport and you see all those beautiful photographs of nature, and I think, gee whiz, I wish that the state of Utah would put more money into protecting those resources, even though a lot of times they're on federal land, than just taking pretty pictures of them. And are they going to put up new pictures in the new airport that shows all the people that are now at those places? Sorry, I digress. And to be fair, I wanted to end on perhaps a positive side of the new base of land ownership in the rural West, as has been observed by Justin. There's these people that come in with a lot of money. Oftentimes, they are more economically able, financially able to put land and water conservation efforts into their land. So the farmers and ranchers that have lived there that we work with quite frequently, they had to live off that land, put food in their family's mouth, keep a roof over their head. So their ability to really do conservation was restricted. The new landowners that have more flexibility financially, we have found that at times, they are very eager to do some extensive restoration work on their property and water and land conservation. So I wanted to leave you on that positive note instead of everything being negative. So with that, I will turn my time over to Breanna.
Hi everyone, I'm Breanna Sweetie, and I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford University. And in interest of full disclosure of my own migrant status, I'm not from the West. My mom is Brazilian, my dad is the son of Irish immigrants, and he grew up partially in Lake Havasu, Arizona. I grew up in South Florida, moved west for school, stayed because of jobs. Now I'm moving to Idaho because of my husband, so I consider myself a relational migrant. But I have found that in general, where you live, you end up really caring about not only the landscape, but the people. So I care deeply about the West and have, been really enriched by studying and living here. So today I am going to strive to reflect on how all the things that we've been talking about, how they impact rangeland use, management, and health. So I think we have a tendency to want to ask this question: is this going to be good or bad? A little bit of what I'm going to say today is saying that might not be the best question to ask, but we see rampant development over unique rangeland habitat, but we also think maybe we're going to move away from, livestock grazing on public lands, which we thought in the past has been ecologically damaging. We might also conceptualize, as Elizabeth was talking about, these amenity migrants as conservation land buyers who are going to make big conservation investments into the land. Or we might think about them as out-of-state absentee owners that really are going to drive mismanagement of these lands. So right off the bat, I just want to highlight there's a lot of uncertainty with actual outcomes environmentally on the ground. So here's my little roadmap. I'll do a quick background on rangelands generally, talk a little bit about the direct impacts of amenity migration, which we see as rangeland conversion, which I think people have focused a lot on through the conference. But I'm also going to talk a lot about the less visible changes as far as who manages and what we manage for on these lands. I'll use a little bit of my ongoing work to try to demonstrate that in Idaho. And then I'll reflect on what all of this means as far as environmental consequences, particularly looking at the process of reductions in grazing area and intensity across a lot of the West and some of the surprising outcomes of that. In particular, looking at this process of how those grazing changes might impact conifer encroachment, which we consider to be a threat to valuable rangeland habitat. So quick background, just so we're all on the same page. When I talk about rangelands, I mean lands that are dominated by grasses, forbs, shrubs, not trees, and they've been historically maintained that way through ecological processes and land management. They provide a lot of values we care about, both for ecosystem services, ecological process, and for culture and livelihoods. But they're also the most transformed biome on the planet. They're the most readily converted to agriculture and also to development. You don't have to chop down trees, it's cheaper. So a lot of what remains as natural rangeland tends to be considered to be pretty marginal. It's arid, low productivity, remote, rugged land. So for a long time now, we've mostly been using it for livestock grazing. Ranchers who are willing to be out there for the way of life, for their tradition, and they're the ones using these lands. But amenity migration has the ability to not only transform how we use these lands and what we use them for, but also the coupled human-natural system that sort of drives dynamics on these lands. So just quickly, because other folks have talked about this in more detail, we definitely are seeing rangeland loss and fragmentation in a lot of parts of the West. We've lost millions of acres of rangeland to these processes, most heavily in California. As Bruce mentioned, we've had a lot of these challenges for a long time in California. This is Sun Valley, familiar site, I think, to a lot of you. So those valleys have been completely taken over by development. But it's not a uniform process. There's a lot of places in the West that actually haven't experienced rapid conversion of agriculture. So there are places that there's sort of more indirect or less visible changes going on as far as who manages and what we manage for. So just as a kind of overview of, we've really seen a changing cohort of ranch owners. This is, I think, the best and most detailed study, I did not conduct it, in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And they found average ranch turnover rates of 23% from the period of 1990 to 2001, and some rates in some counties up to 45%. That's a pretty rapid transformation of who's owning these lands, particularly given that for a lot of history, or for our recent history, they've often been in one family for 5 generations. And amenity buyers purchased 39% of those ranches, or over half of acres sold. Another way of looking at the same data is that 62% of ranch acres went to out-of-state buyers across all these different ranch buying groups. So what does that mean for actual land management? Are these conservation or absentee owners? We do know that absentee owners in these places are far less likely to manage weeds on their property. Someone mentioned this risk yesterday. We also know that new owners are more likely to allocate water to in-stream uses. They're more likely to invest in riparian ecosystem restoration, but they're also more likely to invest in fish pond construction, which can be good or bad. It depends on the place, and a lot of these investments can be more focused on the desire to improve the fisheries resource for fishing recreation rather than really thinking holistically about ecosystem management. We also might be concerned about loss of local environmental knowledge. We do know that absentee landowners are far less likely to have scientific or traditional management knowledge, and they're less likely to have contact with extension and local natural resource program staff. So they're kind of participating in the process of land management in a pretty different way than some of the older owners. So a lot of what I've been talking so far is about private land management, but as we know, the West is dominated by public lands. So how might amenity migration impact public rangeland management and use? This is a map of areas where extensive livestock grazing has been declining on public land in recent history. Maybe we can catch up here with my slides. So this has been a process that's been going on since the mid-20th century, but it might be accelerating. This is the figure just from 2000 to 2015. On average, we saw declines of 15% on public lands, with extremes of up to 67% in Wyoming, so that's pretty amazing. But it's challenging to assess how much of this is due to amenity migration. We know that a lot of places in the West are going through complex rural restructuring and transitions. So I think that calls for us to look at this at a little finer resolution and at a regional scale to really understand what's going on. I also note that this data is not considered to be the most reliable because reporting of actual use on public lands can be difficult. So my current work is, as I mentioned, in Idaho in a region we call the High Divide. So it spans central Idaho. I'm looking here trying to trace how and why grazing is changing over a long period of time from 1940 to present. And I'm doing that through a really detailed review of public agency management records, mostly Forest Service, over 170 allotments. This adds up to like tens of thousands of pieces of paper, mostly in basements. And so I think there's a lot to say about this region, but I think we really need a flag. Of course, there's Sun Valley here, the original ski resort. We learned a little bit about that history yesterday. But this region also includes places like Challis, which is the county seat of Custer County. And Challis really hasn't experienced any direct amenity migration. There aren't people moving there to live and enjoy amenity spaces, but there is a lot of sort of spillover use from Sun Valley and Boise into the area to use the public lands. A lot of it's backcountry use, so people that come in there often don't even spend a single dollar in the place. And so Challis or Custer County has higher rates of poverty than the rest of Idaho, up around 20%. And agriculture is very visible, very culturally important, only about 10% of jobs. People argue a lot about how important it is to the economy, though. So in this area, this is sort of just early results. I not only do document review, but I do spend a lot of time hanging out and talking to people and interviewing. And people definitely do describe that the biggest change in their valley is more people, less cows. So we've seen a 25% of historic allotments on public lands are now closed to grazing in this region, and that corresponds to about 25% of the area that was historically grazed. And so I just wanted to highlight here what I've identified as sort of 6 pathways of these grazing reductions, and I'd focus on the first 4. This doesn't supposed to end here, but the first 4 are really driven heavily by amenity migration is what I've seen. So the first 2 have a lot to do with how agencies have changed their management over time, and they're really being driven by fear of lawsuits, as Steve kind of alluded to, and so they're often either reducing intensity of grazing in the area or closing areas altogether. But it's not always just that. Sometimes it's just the increased administrative burden means that ranchers are kind of throwing in the towel and saying, I either want to focus more on my private land or I'm just going to get out of it altogether because it's just so hard to do well and meet all the regulations and monitoring requirements. Occasionally, these do end up in court, and so the court gets to decide whether the allotments stay open or closed. And what I want to highlight is that amenity migration really does impact this. While we might think that these regulations are of public lands are happening at national scales, amenity migrants are the ones that are showing up in the Forest Service offices to complain about cows. They're the ones writing comments in these areas. They're the ones that the Forest Service agency is paying the most attention to. I don't think they pay attention to the comments coming from New York as much as they do from people in their backyard, from what I've observed, even if they're supposed to. And then there's also these spillover impacts that end up affecting how we use public land. So amenity migration is obviously increasing land values in many places, and sometimes the temptation to sell the ranch because you can really make a much better livelihood just doing that and retiring than you can ranching becomes too great. So a new owner of that land won't necessarily want to continue ranching, and they definitely don't want to deal with the Forest Service, so they'll just stop grazing the allotment that's connected to it. And then we also see traditional or rancher retirement, which is a problem in ranching and agriculture across the country. But as ranchers retire, there's just not a traditional replacement to keep that going, and that is affected by amenity migration. Finally, the last 2 pieces I would say are not as important in my study region. I haven't seen them driving this change, but they are important. We've seen really transformations in the global beef supply chain that have really changed the economics of ranching. But I've also noticed that the ranchers that I speak with, they haven't made money doing this a long time. They're really, really committed to keeping it as a way of life. So this isn't necessarily driving the way that they're decision making. And environmental change, other areas that are, experiencing wholesale cheatgrass invasion, for instance, are we going to see different impacts of this? But in my study region, it might drive some agency decision making, but it's not as prevalent. So what does all this mean for environmental consequences on the ground? It's a little bit counterintuitive to think that, I'm talking about reductions in grazing intensity maybe potentially being bad for ecosystems. We, I think, have a tendency to think that we're just going to see natural regeneration of these lands when we stop using them. And either because we have real long histories of using them in a different way, and because those ecosystems are driven by a lot of different factors, that might not be the case. We don't really have that much evidence that when you just remove cows from a landscape, it regenerates on itself. I will say there's some evidence that species diversity could increase in riparian areas, but it depends on which metric you use, and it's controversial too. We also might see displacement of impacts, so we have to grow this beef somewhere that we still need calves in the beef supply chain, so who's gonna grow them? And we've seen cases of both losses and increases in biodiversity. We might see changes in fire regimes because cows are good at removing fine fuels that help reduce fire spread. And then finally, this last one I think is really uncertain, and this is where I'm focusing my work, is this impact on tree and shrub encroachment into valuable rangeland habitat, notably mountain meadows, but also sagebrush steppe. I put sheep here to not forget about sheep because I'm mostly talking about cows, but in my region there are still sheep. So conifer encroachment, yeah, I mentioned there's a little bit of evidence that this might be happening and might be driven by changes in grazing regimes. That connection is much more established in Europe, but we have more sort of site-specific understanding of it in the American West. And so it's hard to think about trees as being bad. We don't, it just doesn't work for most people, but they can be kind of difficult in some landscapes. They change hydrology, they use a lot more water. They change fire regimes. They reduce forage quality, not just for livestock, but for wildlife too. And they tend to sort of homogenize a landscape, so reduce biodiversity. If you lose your meadows, you're going to get less biodiversity. So as I mentioned, we don't have a great understanding of this, and unfortunately I don't have the results yet of my ongoing work, but I will flag that I'm trying to do a sort of natural experiment across this entire landscape to look at how grazing regime changes, that data from my first study that I showed you, how that's impacting conifer cover, and I'm using historic and current images to map that over the landscape. So I'll love to answer more questions about that, but I'll just flag it. So finally, the kind of points I want to leave you all with are just that I really think that these Amenity West dynamics, we really need to think about these transitions as not being uniform. They're not the same everywhere. It's not just going in one direction, but there really is a lot of site specificity. And that's the same for the ecosystem response. Not all these ecosystems evolve the same way with grazing as a disturbance. Some depend on it, some are more fragile. And so there's not one homogeneous response we can expect from the landscape. And that those changes that we're seeing are not necessarily positive or negative as well. They're just different. We see emergent rural ecologies, and they just have a new set of trade-offs that we have to deal with. These landscapes have always been in flux, and they've always been subject to land management for a long time. So while I didn't touch too much on this, some of my other work focuses more heavily on it. I think that there's opportunities for conflict and collaboration in every landscape, in every setting. And so what we need to do is kind of pay attention to the regional specificities that are enabling one or the other. So yeah, that's just my point. I also want to thank all of the funders that support my work and the Byrne Center, all of you, and Bruce Kane, who's on my committee and supporting me through my work. So thanks, everyone.
We have about 25 minutes for Q&A. I won't have any comments except that it was very interesting here the way Breanna ended it with, it really sounded a lot like values arguments as well, and just the use of the word encroachment with regard to trees. That's, I think it's a biological term, but it's like a values-based term. It's development encroachment, tree encroachment. It was pretty intriguing. So let's have questions from the audience now. In the back.
I have a somewhat different point of view that I'd like to throw out, and it's been touched on a little bit in this panel. But I think most attention to addressing rural issues and the amenity migration is based on the assumption that the trends of the last 30 years or so are going to continue on into the future. And so the solutions are geared to catching up with these past changes. I think that we're not adequately addressing what's going to be happening in the next 5, 10, 15, 30 years because of climate change and the food and water shortages that the entire world will experience. I think that we're going to have tremendous shortages, and I think these are going to be the emergency situations which we'll have to address. And one of the big issues that I see with rural areas, and actually all of the United States, is that we no longer have food independence, local food independence. For example, in Wayne County, where I live, they used to have not only cows, but sheep, turkeys, pigs, chickens. So there were cheese factories, dairies, eggs, all different crops were grown, root vegetables in one area, the seasonal summer vegetables in a different area, melons in the east part of Wayne County, and there was basically food independence. That's gone away. One disaster shutting down Highway 24 for several days would cut off almost all the food that people in Wayne County now rely on being trucked in. I think that one of the ways of addressing all of the issues for rural counties, particularly the economic and future coming issues, would be to encourage food independence. But that means doing things differently, because we've lost so much of the topsoil. It means greenhouses, it means water-wise farming, hydroponics, using technology to help produce the food that we then consume locally instead of shipping it across the country or across the world. So if that scenario could be what's coming, I'd like to see us address some of those issues.
Anybody want to address that one?
I guess what I'd say is I couldn't agree more. And as far as the effects of climate change, you're exactly right. Is it not on? There we go. As I said, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that that reflects the importance of trying to retain the economic viability of these bases for those rural communities. I can't really say, I mean, the Nature Conservancy doesn't have all the answers, that's for sure, but trying to collaborate with people, and I think there's been a lot of discussion about that on the other panels about how we can build that economic base in the rural communities so that it maintains that kind of food independence and reduces the carbon footprint, all of the above. So I don't know if that's a very good answer or not. I think it's a very good observation, but I don't know that I have any answers to offer.
Yeah, I don't know if I have answers. I'll just share some observations from the study region that I'm in. I think, Sun Valley has a whole resilience institute focused on building a local food system. Chalice obviously doesn't, and you might consider Chalice to be somewhat closer to a food desert despite being an agricultural community or valuing agriculture. So people there are working on it, but it's coming more from just local people who care, that are growing a garden and starting a farmer's market, and it's not necessarily very organized or at the same scale as we sort of see regional planning can do. But it's definitely a challenge that people care about and think about.
So you mentioned two things, one with regard to climate change and one with food systems, but I'm also wondering if Steve wants to comment on are our federal laws and the lawsuits being filed under them, are they able to address climate change issues?
Well, actually, the most important ongoing federal litigation involving climate change is in the District of Oregon, from my understanding of it. There is climate change litigation going on everywhere. Typically, the cases have been thrown out because of a lack of standing. It's the analogy you would make. A taxpayer can't ordinarily challenge any federal statute because on the basis of saying, well, that statute affects me because my tax dollars are going to support it. Courts have said that's not a significantly acute enough interest to allow you to be able to pursue that claim in court. And so the problem, of course, with global climate change from that perspective is because it affects literally everyone on the planet, the courts have been hesitant to get involved, and they've said this is really a policy issue that the Congress needs to work out or the executive branch needs to take hold of, and judges can't really handle it, and we're not sure that an individual plaintiff has sufficient standing to be able to bring the case in court. However, this case in Eugene was brought by some high school students, and they're represented in part by some University of Oregon Law School professors. And a district judge there said, look, I think that you do have standing, and was able to infer from some of the protections in the Constitution, in particular, somewhat drawing on the Declaration of Independence and the right to life, and liberty and pursuit of happiness, saying, look, those are effectively, were engrafted into the Constitution, and you have a right to life, and part of that is a healthy climate. And your generation is going to bear the burden of this, or maybe now we're hearing more recently, it might be a lot more imminent, some of these consequences than we had previously understood. The judge is now saying, look, the other branches are not dealing with this. The courts are going to step in and try to put pressure. And this case will probably end up going to the U.S. Supreme Court. It's been there once already, and the Supreme Court punted on it based on how widespread the discovery was going to be. The discovery process in litigation, as you may know, is the ability to go in and get evidence from the other side to support your case. And they were, the plaintiffs in this case had served discovery. They wanted to depose the Secretary of State and other cabinet officials, and I think the Supreme Court thought that was probably a little too broad. Anyway, so back to your question, it's being narrowed, but it eventually will probably end up in the Supreme Court, and I think judges are getting frustrated with the inability of the other branches to deal effectively with it, and so they are starting to be a little more assertive in saying the judiciary may have a role to play here.
But the role has been very limited so far.
Very limited so far, and no cases have really gone to fruition where we've seen impacts. The most I've seen is in NEPA cases, the National Environmental Policy Act, where federal agencies have to evaluate the impacts of their activities on the environment. Judges have said, look, I'm not going to say what you have to do to address climate change, but you didn't address it sufficiently in this particular document.
Other questions? Down in front here.
Thank you. This question is probably mostly for Breanna. Can you tell us what percentage of the beef consumed in this country originates on our public lands, and what is the cost to the United States taxpayers of managing that program?
I'm not going to be able to do the numbers, but what I will say, which I should be able to probably, is that our beef supply chain still really hasn't been able to handle raising calves in confinement. So there's this really important part, not for like the total number produced, but the whole supply chain depends on cows grazing and raising their young. So then those young calves go into the confinement. So there's an important dependency on it. And what the second part was, the cost to taxpayers. I think people argue about that a lot, that they argue about grazing leases being too low, but really ranchers end up spending a lot of money. They have to invest in the infrastructure to be able to do the ranching, so they are responsible in many cases for building fences and building water infrastructure, and they also do a lot of just general management on these lands, controlling weeds, et cetera. The government does spend a fair amount of money on the grazing program, but I'm not sure I've heard it be a little overblown, probably, the cost to taxpayers of that program.
Does anybody else have?
Yeah, I was looking at you.
Pat needs a microphone.
I got in serious trouble when I raised the grazing permit from 85 cents to $1.15. And that time, the private grazers were charging, or private landowners were charging $5 to $6. So there was a tremendous disparity between what you could graze on public lands versus private lands. But I really do agree with the food independence. I mean, the notion now for BLM is that we are energy independent, so we're tearing off the landscape looking for energy when solar and renewable energy is there. We are completely ignorant on food independence, and that's a very frightening prospect.
I'll just add on that, not to contradict you at all, but I think that the one-to-one comparison of private land grazing to public land grazing isn't necessarily fair, because it is kind of more costly, and it's a totally different thing to graze on these remote public lands than it is to, graze on a rich valley bottom or something on private ground. So there's a little bit of room for debate about that too.
So I always tell my grad students in public policy to have crazy thoughts, to be creative. So I was just wondering, for example, if you pull cows off of federal lands or they disappear from the federal lands and trees encroach, isn't that carbon sequestration? Isn't that a good thing for climate change? And should that be thought about in NEPA processes? Or is it the fact they're going to burn? Is that bad?
Yeah, so generally trees in North America aren't that great at carbon sequestration. And that's partially because they're really liable to burn up and release that carbon back into the air. So that's what one of my main advisors at least likes to answer that question with, who's a rangeland ecologist, so she might be biased. But yeah.
I'm just to add, I guess, on the grazing side, I've gotten involved in some grazing cases more recently, and there's a couple of issues there I guess I would point out. The first is that by statute, all of our public lands are multiple use sustained yield. Okay, this goes back to my bullet, which talks about why it can be frustrating to try and deal with the fact you have a huge amount of public land, because they are supposed to be, and Congress is great at this. They'll pass laws that do everything, right? We want you to make sure that all the ranchers are going to be able to continue their way of life. We want you to protect endangered species. We want you to provide for economic development. And also deal with all these other issues that we're having our constituents complain about at the same time. And then a lot of times these are passed in extraordinarily broadly framed statutes. And the agencies, particularly the Forest Service and BLM, who are multiple use agencies, have to try and resolve and find a way to make all of these particular values and objectives fit together. And so it's extremely difficult to do. But when I talk to my clients who are involved in livestock grazing, they say, look, the statute tells us to allow for all these different uses. Now, we have to do it within the parameters of these other statutes, like the Endangered Species Act, which has, in my experience, been the main constraint on grazing that has brought the level of livestock grazing down in certain riparian areas in particular. And the jury is still out, I think, as to whether or not those particular uses or values can coexist in certain areas. I think in certain riparian areas, maybe they can because of the topography or other on-the-ground improvements that can be made to protect riparian areas, and probably in certain other areas, maybe grazing shouldn't continue, even though it's been done for many, many years. And there needs to be an alternative that's examined. But it does all come down ultimately to values. Those are reflected in our laws. And then ultimately, if in the management of those laws, people are not satisfied with how they're being implemented, in court. And that's become the venue of last resort for how these issues are resolved. But I will also say in these areas we visited in rural Oregon, livestock grazing is one of the very few economic engines that some of these areas have left, that they have not converted to these amenity communities, right? So the two that came about when I was over there were we have livestock grazing and we've become the garbage dumps for Western Oregon. If, you know, on the west side of the Cascades is where all the population is, and we're sending all of our landfill, all of our trash over to Eastern Oregon now, and they'll take it because they need some economic development on that side. And then they have grazing. Most of the timber mills have been shut down. And so there are some interesting developments. We have the cheap hydropower. We have renewables, so some of these areas that have a lot of sunshine are turning to solar and other renewables, wind power. We also have huge server farms from Facebook, Google on the Columbia River and some of these more remote areas because they have access to cheap hydropower. So that change is coming, but it takes time, and that goes back to my other side, why change is so hard, especially if people feel it's imposed upon them, right? To the extent folks can feel like they're a part of this change and they are able to influence the way it occurs over time, they'll be much more likely to get on board. And then you'll have a durable resolution as opposed to what we now have, what I see in a lot of natural resources issues. We have a ping pong match. Who's in the White House, right? That's no way to manage natural resources. So we have one particular occupant in the White House and the pendulum goes all the way over here. And then we have another occupant and goes over there. Every 4 to 8 years, is that any way to manage sustainably natural resources for the benefit of the people who've lived there for many years? Of course not. It's unfair to them because they need some degree of certainty. I think most people can adapt to change if they have a sense of what is going to happen over time. But when it's swinging back and forth and there's plenty of demagoguery to go around to say, oh no, if I get elected, guess what? We're going back to the way it was 50 years ago. Or guess what? If I get elected, we're going to shut this complete industry down tomorrow. That sets these people up, I think, for failure in a lot of ways. I think that's also why we're seeing a lot of the, frankly, some of the social dislocation and really super adverse effects. Somebody put the opioid crisis on the slide the other day. I was so glad to see that. That is at epidemic levels in a lot of these rural communities, and it has, I think it's directly related to a lot of the uncertainty, the knife's edge that some of these people live on every day.
Did you want to follow up?
One of my pet peeves, which goes to what Steve was talking about, when I was with the federal government, I had to deal with 3 different budgets because you had the budget in Interior, you had the budget at Congress, and you actually had the budget you were operating on. And the idea in the 21st century, and then Congress passes continuing resolutions, so you don't know with a 15 to 20% variance what your budget's going to be. You just end up not being able to make, looking to the future, you're always looking backward as to what you did. So we really do need to change the budgeting system for land management agencies.
DeFlint?
In Utah, we've seen what I would say a lot of stunt casting, or these big grand gestures to either protest or promote some of these public land use policies. Famously, we have a state representative who owes the federal government $100,000 for an illegal ATV ride in one of our canyons as a protest effort. So I want to see do you guys have success stories of public lands use compromises or resolutions that didn't involve grand stunts, lawsuits, or an act of Congress essentially to settle the matter?
Well, I think that comes down to, what you hear about are things like that. You don't hear about the success stories or the stories that are, kind of just the ordinary run of the mill, people carrying on their lives. There are success stories, in my opinion. With the Nature Conservancy, we own the Dugout Ranch down that is currently within the boundaries of the Indian Creek unit of the Shrunken Bears Ears National Monument. We hold 4,000 acres of fee land and then federal grazing permits, either BLM or Forest Service, on 300,000 acres of federal land. And that, to me, is a success story because we are able to work with the BLM land managers and the Forest Service land managers. They're on the ground. We are responsive. I mean, it's a good relationship, as I mentioned in my talk. That's where we build our root relationships that then lead to further collaborative efforts. And it's really those one-on-one relationships that provide the basis for a success. I'm sure that there are other ranches in the area that maybe would disagree with me vehemently, but I think it is all in recognizing the constraints that they are under, the federal land managers, as was just mentioned, budgetary. The weather, the climate change, I mean, all of these things impact how they manage on a seasonal basis. And it also impacts, obviously, the rancher's bottom line. So I think it is, like I said, I think that there are a lot of success stories out there. I think what gets the attention are the ones that don't work, the Clive and Bundys of the world. There are a lot of ranchers out there that I think work very successfully with federal land managers. Maybe, Breanna, you either agree or disagree with that.
No, in general, I agree. The agency managers I've talked with say, oh, every classroom has one bad apple, but in general, we have really good relationships with the permittees, and I hear the same from the ranchers that maybe that they're the ones open to talking with me, so I'm going to keep trying to figure that out. But In the region I'm working in, there are a lot of examples of active collaboration that don't get as much attention. They're currently redoing their forest plan for the Salmon Chalice National Forest, and a sort of separate whole on-the-ground collaborative has sprung up to sort of try to build consensus across boundaries in that process. And they've decided they would rather do it on their own and don't want the Forest Service involved, and then they're going to come and deliver their results to the Forest Service, which is a sort of new experiment in that process. So we'll see. They're actively working with them, so I don't want to play that down too much. But right now in their draft of what they're going to submit to the Forest Service, we want to maintain access, no net loss of access on the forest, including for motorized use, and we also want to maintain quiet recreation. So they consider that a huge success, is that this group has sort of talked together, and we're going to put those two kind of buzzy words that can trigger people a little bit on either side about how we use these lands, and we're going to put them together, and we're really going to try to do both, and they think that they can get both in this landscape. So that's one example.
I just want to follow up. So one of the factors, obviously, in the part of the world where dugout is all of the recreation that is now going on, the rock climbers that come to climb Super Crack on BLM land that's right next door to Dugout Ranch. So that is another challenge for those federal land managers, and they struggle, and it comes down a lot of times to education and outreach. The people that come to do these recreational activities, do they understand the value of these lands? That's a word that's come up a lot over the last few days. And in particularly, do they acknowledge the Native Americans' value of these lands? So that has added yet another layer of complication to already a very complicated situation. And as other people have said, and they don't have the funds to deal with it. Sorry, Steve.
No worries. Just really quickly, I want to add, because this incident has come up several times, and I've had some involvement with it, and that's the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge occupation. And you're going to think I'm crazy when I cite that as an example of a success story on at least one level. And I'm going to tell you why. It's because that the Bundys came into town, and the very first thing they did was try to rile up the locals and get everybody from the local community there in Byrne to join them on the refuge. Do you know how many from Byrne actually went out there and occupied? 0. And the main reason why, it goes to a lot of things that you were talking about, those relationships that were built, and over time, the willingness of some of those locals in the community to take some real leadership, including the county judge, who is effectively the head county commissioner in those counties. They call them county judges in Oregon. And he made it very clear that while he agreed with the Bundys substantively on a lot of their concerns with how the federal government was managing those lands, he did not want or expect his community to go to extra legal means to effectuate those complaints and concerns. And he said, look, we're going to work within the system, not outside of it. And so to me, I look at that as a real success. And there was a 10-year process that was engaged in that involved local, regional, and federal collaboration to develop a plan for managing the National Wildlife Refuge. And that painstaking effort, as difficult as it was, I think laid the groundwork for the fact that most of the people, and people were taking meals out from Byrne. They were somewhat sympathetic to the occupiers, but they did not want to go outside the legal means of petitioning for redress of their grievances.
I just want to go quickly back to something Elizabeth said before. If I heard you correctly, the Nature Conservancy holds large grazing permits. How do you manage them? Are you keeping the cattle on and helping ranchers? Are you thinking about it ecologically?
Definitely. I mean, that's, so not to drone on too much about it, but we bought the Dugout Ranch back in 1994, basically to preserve it as open space and hope that a developer didn't come in. It's an absolutely drop-dead gorgeous part of the world. And with that came the grazing permits. The operator that we bought it from, Heidi Red, I'm sure a lot of people in this room know that name. She continued to, we leased it back to her, and she continued to operate it as a cattle ranch. Then about 10 years ago, she retired, and we bought the cattle herd from her, reduced the number of herd in the herd, and we're now using the herd and research that we do as part of the Canyonlands Research Center, which is basically studying how, if and how, grazing can continue sustainably on the Colorado Plateau in the face of climate change. So we are actually using the cattle herd in our research, and we've got partnerships with USGS, Forest Service, University of Arizona, USU. We have a science committee that basically reviews science projects that want to come and do research at the CRC. And it's not just about grazing. They also are doing a lot of research on the cryptobiotic soils, which are so precious and which are damaged by cattle and rock climbers and everybody, to cottonwood research on adaptability of different cottonwood species. So that's a long answer to, yes, we do have grazing allotments, and we do manage them primarily now for ecological benefits.
Great. That's super interesting. How much time do we have? A few minutes. One more question. This is like the end of one of my classes, and I say this time one more question, and nobody will ask it.
If there's no other question, can I just add one other thing? Oh, did you have a question? Okay, yeah. To what you were saying, I'm so glad to hear they're doing that research, you're doing that research, or collaborating and doing that research, because it reminded me of a comment I once heard from Jack Ward Thomas, who was the main author of the Northwest Forest Plan, and is a biologist by training, and ended up becoming the Forest Service chief in the Clinton administration. And anyway, he told me one time when we were litigating the Northwest Forest Plan, he said, ecosystems are not only more complex than we think, they're more complex than we can think. And the point is that it's easy to demagogue on all these issues. You see the bumper sticker, cows kill salmon. Well, yeah, maybe, depending upon how the grazing is occurring and where and under what conditions and so forth. But on the other hand, cows provide food, or I don't know what the countervailing bumper sticker would be. And so the reality is that we need to approach these issues with respect to environmental effects, I think, with a great deal of humility. I always analogized it to the stock market. Think about all the different variables that affect the stock market. When we did the Northwest Forest Plan, we were trying to tease out the environmental effects over the next century of what would happen to the old growth forest ecosystems in the Northwest. Imagine saying what the stock market's going to be in 100 years. I mean, so, which isn't to say we shouldn't try. It's a useful exercise, and I think it helps inform our debate, our discussion, and the resolution of those issues. But at the same time, there needs to be some humility and an understanding of the complexities of these systems that we're dealing with, which I think will make us more conservative in a good way in both directions. So we can't say we automatically know cows are always going to be bad, right? But at the same time, we shouldn't rush headlong into a major development that we are not quite sure what the effects could be as well in a community that has persisted in a certain way for many, many years. There needs to be humility on all sides.
No, that's a great summative comment that I didn't need to make. Let's thank the panelists.